You do not have to travel these highways alone. And it is especially pleasing when our people demonstrate their love by being with you. The idea of black people on Sundays going from one venue to another is not new. As a matter of fact, when we all grew up, we know that on Sundays we went from one church to another. We did the 11 o'clock service, and then there was some other church that everybody packed up and went over there. And then in the evening we went somewhere else. So that same kind of spirit is being shown on this level. And this is really amazing because unlike the church, which in many instances is approved by the white man, demonstrated by the white Jesus and the American flag, that drapes the institution, despite the fact the First Amendment says there's supposed to be separation of church and state. We bring the state into the church, and that defines the state of the church. But given that, it is certainly wonderful that so many of us can come out and be with African Echoes. A lot of people obviously characterize this as being African-centered, but it's also being African-interested, and also having African interests. The key fact here is that we are here because we are the custodians of our history. That history has to be preserved, and then it has to be bequeathed to another generation. And if there ever come a time in our race where all of us forego our responsibility of preserving the rich history of our people, then at that time there will be no hope for the race. And so what is being done here, what is being done in so many other places, is so important. I also want to acknowledge the Brothers Glass and the Razar bookstore. I think I'm pronouncing it right, but I certainly know they're from Trenton, New Jersey. I want them to stand and let us give them a warm round of applause. So we know that people are coming far and near in order to be with us. On December 2nd, the USA Today ran a story on Thurgood Marshall. And the question that it raised, in effect, was whether Thurgood Marshall was a snitch. We want to broaden the question tonight, but we are going to deal with the snitch component of it. We want to broaden it to include the question of the civil rights legacy of Thurgood Marshall and its impact on African liberation. The civil rights legacy of Thurgood Marshall and its impact on African liberation. Now, in all of this, the question of whether black people have the capacity to snitch or not in a land such as America has really been resolved years ago. We certainly do not start the proposition that it is impossible or it is unprecedented that blacks have snitched on other blacks. Going back to Denmark Vesey, for example, a brother who by all means could have left South Carolina as a, quote, free person, and yet chose to stay because of the love that he had for his people and labored to liberate his people. And in the midst of his plans to liberate his people was a house Negro who was more attached to the master than he was to his brothers and sisters who had a deep thirst for liberty. We understand that. We understand that on January 15, 1923, a committee of 8 under the banner Marcus Garvey Must Go wrote a letter to the Attorney General, Daughtry, outlining how Garvey had to be dealt with. We understand that. But this is important because it has become a barrier to our liberation. The reason why is because white people place such a great value on information. They understand that information is power. The great international bankers put more emphasis on information than anything else in order for them to acquire wealth and to maintain wealth. The Rothschild family was able to take Europe because of information and disinformation that they were spreading at the time. So we understand the significance of information. Information is such that it is even classified. If you get there in the area of stocks, it's inside information. If you deal in the area of the law, it's privileged information. If you're in the intelligence bureau, it's classified and declassified information. And so information is a subject unto itself. But it is the basis for all people acquiring power. And this is the reason why our assembling here is a threat by our mere assembling here, acquiring information. This is something that was never envisioned by the so-called founding fathers. When even after the passage of the Constitution, slave codes were announced, it said that 3 blacks could not meet unless a white person was present. I remember when we were involved in the Central Park jogger trial, and that was certainly a critical period. One of my clients, Michael Briscoe, whose case was dismissed before trial, and he did not have to go to trial on the charge. But I remember in our pretrial hearings where we wanted to show that the state lacked probable cause to stop these young men, that there was no basis for the stop in the first place, and therefore any confession, statement, or admission that arose out of the unlawful stop was inadmissible. So I remember as I was cross-examining one of the arresting officers, and I said, well, on this particular evening, you went into the park. You didn't see anybody in the park, is that correct? And he said, no, I didn't see anybody in the park. And I said, you got no identification of anybody, is that correct, from anybody in the park? He said, no, we didn't get any identification. We went in the park. After we got the call, we checked on the young lady, and then we immediately began to just run up and down the neighborhoods. And I said, well, at that time you came upon about a group of 10 young black men, is that correct? And he said, yes, we did. And I said, they were not running when you saw them, were they? And he said, no, they were not. And I said, they were walking in a very civilized manner, yes. They were. There was no evidence from their outward appearance that gave you a reason to believe that they had been engaged in illegal activity. Is that correct? Now, I'm knowing that I'm scoring all kinds of points and getting right to the essence of it. And so then I said, well, what was the basis for the stop? And he said this was an unlawful assembly. 10 black men walking up the street is an unlawful assembly. And so that was the basis for the stop. That's the reason why we arrested them. Unlawful assembly. So it shows you that despite all that we think that we have gotten in terms of racial progress and in terms of racial liberation, white folks' minds are back 400 years ago. That's where their minds are. Your minds may be somewhere else, but their minds are 400 years ago. The only thing they saw is 10 Negroes without a white man. All right? That's what they saw. 10 Negroes without a white man. And so, as you know, one thing led to another, and many of these young men are behind bars right now as a result of that particular case. But it begins to point out something. When I first started practicing law back in 1973, I learned things that law school did not prepare you for. And there really was not any black lawyers who took you under their wings to help you. And so you really had to learn it yourself. And I generally did because I spent so many hours in the library because I wanted to be good. I didn't want to go out downtown and embarrass myself, but I wanted to challenge the system. Now, I knew that if I was boogalooing every night, doing cocktail sips, then it was going to be difficult for me to go downtown with a thorough knowledge of the law and stand in front of a racist judge and defend my people. And so I had no other alternative but to every night study all night. And I suppose I really gathered that because, and I say this, there's always a need for role models. When I was in Atlanta, Georgia, I remember several lawyers in Georgia that were really good. And it's unfortunate that their names are not well known. One was C.B. King, whom some of you might know from the Albany movement. But C.B. was so bright. He was so bright as an attorney. He could have gone anywhere and practiced law. He wouldn't have made any difference. He was in Albany, Georgia. He was so bright that when he went into a courtroom in these little South Georgia counties, the judges in those counties would have their dictionary while he was talking, and every so often, wait now, boy, what's that word you said? All right. All right. And CB, he said, well, spell that word. And then they would spell it, and they would look down the word. And he said, all right, keep going. And then it gets so far, and then they had to stop him again. Well, that was the kind of lawyer he was. He had a real mastery of the English language. I don't think there was a word in the dictionary that CB did not have a ready working knowledge of. A tremendous lawyer. And so there was C.B. King, and then there was Howard Moore, who some of you may have known later, who represented Angela Davis out in California. Him, and I remember when Howard was in Atlanta, and sometime I would be over at Pascal's, which was really then the headquarters for the movement. In the 60s, it was on Hunter Street then. It's no longer Hunter Street, M.L. King Drive, but then it was Hunter Street. And I remember sometime around 11 o'clock at night, Howard would come in, and sometime I would go over and sit with him, and I would say, well, you know, Mr. Moore, what are you doing here this late at night? He said, well, I just came by to get a cup of coffee. His office was right across the street at then 859.5 Hunter Street, and he would go back. He said, I got to go back. I'll be there the rest of the night. Now, when I graduated from law school, I had no idea what a lawyer was supposed to do, all right, because my parents were not lawyers. I did not have a lawyer in the family, so I had no idea. But I remembered Howard Moore. So when I started practicing law and everybody would leave the office at 7 o'clock and they said, well, Maddox, come on and join us. I said, no, I got to stay here all night. Now, I didn't know why I was staying there all night, all right? But I knew that's what Howard Moore did, all right? And so I said, well, I got to stay there all night. And that's what I did. And then as I stayed there all night, I began to get acquainted with the law, but I knew that I was supposed to be there all night. And so that's how I really got started in terms of really developing a mastery for the law. But as I got involved in court cases, I found out things that I really probably was not prepared for, because I had gone through 3 years of law school, and there's a tremendous amount of brainwashing that goes on there. Even though, like myself, I had been involved in the movement before I went to law school, but in 3 years, isolated from people, it can have an impact on you. And so it can take your mind. That's the reason why I can understand why some of these brothers and sisters have gone AWOL on the race, because of the training that they have gotten while they was in school. But when I first started practicing law, one of my first experiences, and all of this is leading up to Thurgood, but it's a good background. I remember I was representing a young man out in Staten Island. One of my first cases, as a matter of fact, when I got involved in criminal law, for whatever reason, my first 20 or 30 trials were all A felonies. They were murder cases. And, I mean, that was really rough. To start out unseasoned with nothing but murder cases on your docket, that was really rough. But I remember I went out to Staten Island. In fact, the first time we went out there, Leo and I both went out there. And this must have been about 76. And we literally did not know that many people in New York, because as I said so many times, when we came here, we literally got off the boat and did not know anybody in town. Now, you know, over a period of years, you get to learn a lot of people, but we literally did not know people when we got off the boat. And so Leo said, well, you know, I think I better go out there with you. I don't know what Leo could have done. But anyway, she felt like she needed to be out there with me, because it was a real hot case. It was a case involving a white woman, elderly white woman, who had been found in her bed, spread eagle, tied to the bed. She had been raped and stabbed about 15 or 20 times. And so, to make matters even worse, her son was a police in New York City Police Department in Staten Island. And as things happened, I remember when I went to the cell where my client was, he had already confessed to it, and he confessed because he was living with his girlfriend, who was white. And the police said that they were going to bust her for drugs if he did not give a confession. To make matters worse, he was out on parole, and the girlfriend's uncle was an assemblyman in the New York State Assembly. So it was really rough. When we walked into the courthouse out there in Staten Island in 76, and I tell you, this was a real awakening. It was so packed, but the only people in there were cops. It was a sea of blue. There was nobody else in there but cops, and the judge, and that was it. And so, and obviously I walked in, and everybody was just converging really on me. We didn't think we were going to get out of there that day. They even threatened to bomb the courthouse. That's how tight things were, you know, in terms of a baptism. And so I went downstairs, and my client was talking to this white lawyer. And his mother had sought a lawyer through the National Conference of Black Lawyers, and I was with the National Conference of Black Lawyers then. And so I went out because she didn't feel like anybody out there was going to represent her son adequately. So I remember as I was standing there, he was carrying on this exchange with this lawyer. And the lawyer trying to get certain information from him and was saying, Booker, you know, it's no win. You may do better if you put yourself on the mercy of the court. Don't waste the court's time. Don't outrage anybody. Plead guilty today and get this over with. And so I'm standing there listening. because I suppose this guy must have figured that I was some family member at best, or maybe his preacher. All right? But certainly he had no idea that I was another attorney. So I'm sitting there listening to him, and so he says, you know, Briggs, you know, you got a record, all of that, but we could probably try to save you. And so at that time, Booker, who was just looking at him and wasn't saying anything, and I know that was sort of odd because he wasn't really responding to what this man was saying. He was just looking at him real fixed. And he said, don't I know you? No. That's what the guy said. No, you don't know me. He said, are you sure? Then you got to remember, Booker got a rap sheet about that long. And the guy says, no, I don't know you, Briggs, first time I ever laid on you. And so he said, about 15 years ago, weren't you employed in the Richmond County District Attorney's office? He said, yeah. He said, didn't you send me to prison? And the guy said, ha, 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 ha. You got a good memory, Briggs. And he said, man, get out of here. And so that was the end of that. Now, I say all that because we really got involved in this case. But the case, like most cases, had more than meets the eye. And white people always want to suppress the truth. They don't like information ever spread. They like for all to be secret, where they can hold it on people. They don't like to air it, which is why more than 95% of the cases are plea bargains. Not only for the fact of expediting matters and all of that, but also for the fact of just suppressing the truth, not airing the truth. You see, keeping that information secret. And so I remember as I was involved in this case, one day the judge came and called me into his chamber with the district attorney, and he said, Maddox, you've gone far enough. Go back outside in a few minutes. And he said it so casually as though must have been the routine. He said, go back outside. I'll be out there in a minute. We're going to plead Briggs guilty in a few minutes. I said, excuse me? I said, go back outside. We're getting ready to plead him guilty. I said, Judge, I'm representing the man. I said, he has not expressed any interest in pleading guilty. He said, didn't I tell you to go outside? He said, and tell that man that we're getting ready to plead him guilty. You the lawyer, aren't you? I said, yes. He said, well, I just told you that we're going to plead him guilty. He said, what do you think you're supposed to be doing here? And I said, well, I'm supposed to be representing my client. Well, I began to understand that this must be a routine, all right, that I did not understand, all right? It was obviously some kind of routine that I really wasn't on to. And so I said, well, Judge, I can't do that. I said, I can't do that. He said, okay. All right. He said, we'll adjourn to another date. And they did. And then one day, I submitted an affidavit where I stated that I was going to go to trial on another case in Kings County. And the case did not go to trial, but I did go to court that day under the expectation that it was going to go to trial because that had been the representation. And I put that in the affidavit. Came back to Staten Island on another date, and the judge said, Maddox, we want to see you in chambers. And I went in. He said, you know we got you now. I said, you got me? He said, yeah. He said, you remember that affidavit that you filed with the court? I said, yes. He said, that wasn't true. He said, you just committed perjury. He said, we're going to prosecute you to the hilt unless you give us Briggs. And I said, Judge, you want to prosecute me to the hilt. All right, you want to prosecute me to the hilt. I say all of that only to lead into really what we're getting ready to talk about in terms of the subject. When white people give you a license, it's like giving you a loan. It's like selling you food at the local market. It comes at a higher price. It comes at a higher price. White man goes in to buy a house, low interest rate. You go in, and they throw usury on you. All right? All right, you go and buy food. It's at a high rate, high prices. White people can get the best for low prices. All right? It comes at a higher price. Same thing with the practice of law. When they give you that license, you have to pay an added fee in order to maintain it. See, that's the reality. And that's what so many of our people don't understand. That nothing changes. Just because you went to Harvard or Yale or Columbia, Seton Hall, Rutgers, or wherever, nothing changes. Their mind is set. If you have something that they produce, you're going to have to pay a higher price for it. All right? It's theirs. All right? You got to understand that. And so when we look at the life of Thurgood Marshall and his impact on the African liberation, I start out with these statements, of which I'm going to back up in a minute. They may be shocking to some. The difference between Thurgood and Clarence Thomas is that Thurgood used his talents to try to get more Negroes into the big house. Clarence Thomas used his to keep them out. All right? Thurgood used his talents to get more Negroes into the big house. In other words, he was trying to expand the base of house Negroes. If you look at his record, Clarence, on the other hand, is using his talents to keep everybody out of the big house. Now, neither one of them is concerned about the field Negro. All right? Neither one of them is not good. Neither Thurgood nor Clarence would have had compassion for Denmark Vesey or Nat Turner. All right? Neither Thurgood nor Clarence would have had mercy for Denmark Vesey or Nat Turner. Now we're looking at this very critically. Thurgood Marshall grew up in Baltimore and went to college at Lincoln University in Oxford, Pennsylvania, about the year 1925. Lincoln University in 1925 would have had all of us arrested if we had been seen on campus with no reason. Because in 1925, Lincoln University had an all-white faculty. You couldn't get a job as a professor or as a part of the trustee board if you was black. That was Lincoln University in 1925. About 1927, the students conducted a referendum on whether Lincoln should hire black teachers to teach a non-white student body. That's 1927. Thurgood Marshall led the controlling faction against the hiring of black teachers. All right? Thurgood Marshall was vehemently opposed to black teachers teaching black students. And so he voted with the majority to keep blacks out of the school. Now, when Thurgood left Lincoln University to go to law school, he really wanted to go to the University of Maryland because he wanted to be taught by white people. But white people rejected him. And therefore, he had a personal revenge, all right, to take up with white folks on his rejection. Now, this is important because there are many of our leaders today who are inspired only because white folks rejected them at some moment in their life. All right? So when we begin to examine the life of Thurgood, we are not examining it as though he was some isolated traitor and that there's no set pattern. Because the reality of it is that there are so many more, even the overwhelming majority of our leadership, even today, think really in the same manner as Thurgood Marshall. All right? So when he went to go to law school then, he was really left with what most blacks were left with, and that was Howard University. It so happened that time-wise, there was a black lawyer there by the name of Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the best black lawyer I've ever known. In fact, the best lawyer I've ever known. All right? Period. And it's unfortunate that very few people know anything about his legacy or who he really was about. But Charles Hamilton Houston was there, and at that time was teaching blacks how to become social engineers in the legal profession. And so Thurgood, graduating from Howard Law School, went back to Baltimore, where he practiced for a few years with no great amount of prosperity, and finally was hired by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, or NAACP at that time, to work as an associate counsel under Charles Hamilton Houston. And so Thurgood began to get involved in these cases. Now, Charles Hamilton Houston died in 1950, but in the late 40s, it was clear that Charles Hamilton Houston was moving on an international plane, and that he saw the United Nations as a vehicle in which black folks should seek their liberation. Being the kind of outstanding lawyer that he was, obviously this posed a threat. I can only say that he went into the hospital and never came out as a relatively young man in 1950. All right? Now, it was about that same time that there was a court battle going on in various states, Virginia, Delaware, Topeka, Kansas, and Clarendon, South Carolina, in which Thurgood was the lead counsel in South Carolina. Now, much of this is where we are today. That's the reason why it's important to understand why our people reject themselves today. There's a reason why we reject ourselves. There's a reason why more and more of us are beginning to hate ourselves. All right? When the litigation in Clarendon County began, it started as what was called an equalization suit. In other words, black people were not trying to get in white schools. They were trying to get better schools for themselves. Many black teachers understood that if the school was ever integrated, they would be the losers. That's right. All right? Even in 1934, when W.B. Du Bois gave up his role as editor of Crisis magazine and his relationship with NAACP, he stated at that time, even though we know that he had done some other things beforehand, but he stated at that time that it would be wrong for black people to be taught by white teachers because it would cause serious damage to them. And he stated then that black people's condition had gotten worse by 1934 as a result of the NAACP, which was obviously started in 1909 to co-opt the Niagara movement. So when black people were moving toward their own national organization, these white folks, Mary White Overton and others, came in and with money decided that they would establish their organization for us. All right? And felt like they were moving along quite well until Marcus Garvey showed up. And that caused a serious problem because of who Garvey was and what he stood for and the kind of people that he related to. And so obviously he had to be wiped out of the scene because he was messing up with a problem that they were going to resolve in their way. In 1951 or so, when this case went to trial, there was two things very interesting. By that time, Thurgood had decided that instead of an equalization suit, he amended the pleadings and decided that he wanted full-scale integration. Well, that's not surprising when you consider that here's a guy in 1927 voted to have white folks teach black folks. So his whole agenda was to eliminate black teachers right from the outset. This wasn't just something that came up in 1950. His whole idea of blackness was there was something wrong with it. Yeah. You got to remember now, even when the Black Power movement started and black people started calling themselves black, Thurgood said, I will continue to call you Negroes. I'm not going to use the word black. And never did. All right? He said, no, I'm going to use the word Negro. So when you look at his opinion, his opinion was always written with the word Negro in it. Right. All right? Even after black people started using a more suitable terminology to identify who we are. And so when this case went to trial, Thurgood not only did that, but brought Kenneth Clark in, and Kenneth Clark manipulated the scientific testimony where the scientific test showed that black children who was taught by black teachers in a black setting had a greater love for them than black children who was taught in an integrated setting. He had tested students in Massachusetts, and he had tested students in Arkansas. And the results were that black children in a segregated setting, although maybe the resources may be skimpy, but in that segregated setting where black teachers expressed a love for the children, it made up for the absence of resources. Yes. And so when he went to trial, however, he threw that away. That evidence was never presented, and the lawyers from South Carolina never challenged him on it. And so therefore he was able to put into the record an unscientific test claiming that he examined 16 children in South Carolina, and it showed that being in a black setting was bad. And so we have moved now to a situation where many of our own young people today see everything black as being bad. All right? All right, this is where we are. If it's all black, it's bad. I don't like nothing all black. I don't like the old black stuff. I know a lot of people, even with us, with this struggle that we're having in New York City, a lot of people say, well, man, y'all need to let some white folks in there. You know, things would be all right if y'all let some white folks. I don't know why y'all think that y'all good enough to keep white folks out. All right? There's something wrong with the old black stuff. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine told me that he was running for office up in Buffalo. And he was trying to get the preachers to endorse him. But he was running against a white candidate. The preacher really wanted to endorse a white candidate. No, this is Buffalo. Like this. But there must be a bus in every city. All right? All right. And so he decided that rather than to just do an outright endorsement,